Hi, I'm John Haidt, as I said, from NYU and Downtown Restaurant. So I've been coming to this conference since about 2015. I love it. I love the variety of perspectives that we get here. Always learn something new, and just to be refreshed on the vision of a good capitalist society as one that creates abundance, mass flourishing, widely shared prosperity, new opportunities, more decency, less discrimination. So to have that vision refreshed every year is something I really enjoy. And my talk today is going to be on two major threats to that. I'm a social psychologist, and my takeoff point is this major technological change that happened basically in the 2010s. So what you see here is you can find these graphs all over the internet and certainly on Our World in Data, the spread of various technologies. I just picked a few. And so there's a certain point at which, say, everyone's getting radio. And over the course of 10 or 15 years, America, it just becomes the thing. Everyone's got radio. And same for color TV. But what I wanted to show here is that the online world that we now live in came in two waves, two very different waves with very different effects. So in the 1980s, people started buying microcomputers, but there's not a lot you can do with them until you connect them up. And once we get the internet, so you see those first, the blue and the gold bar there, microcomputer and internet, so that's the first wave. And by the end of the 1990s, Americans are, very largely, they have a computer at home, they're online through some service. So this is a big, big change. Connecting everybody to everything is amazing. And what happens? Mental health is fine, it doesn't drop. Democracy is, if anything, getting better. The period from the mid-90s to 2012 is the greatest period of democratic flourishing in human history. So the microcomputer and internet were wonderful. And then there's the second wave. It begins, well, social media platforms go back, they begin in 2003 with MySpace and then Facebook. So people start getting on that on their home computers. But it's not until we get the smartphone, of course, beginning in 2007, but it's not really until like 2009 to 12, that's the period where suddenly now people have given up their flip phones. So it really is in the early 2010s that everything changes, that now pretty much everyone, or most people that you know, have a smartphone with social media on it. This is incredibly new, and as you see from the steepness of that smartphone adoption curve, there's never been a technological change in human history that happened as fast. And when you combine the smartphone with social media, I would say there's never, ever been a change that so radically rewired our thinking, our social relationships, our consciousness, and everything. Now, in a room full of economists, most people look at things like this and they see progress, they see possibility, they see innovation, and of course that's all there. I'm a social psychologist who studies morality and politics and the culture war. And I've been alarmed since 2004 that we're coming apart. And now I'm terrified. I think that what we've gone through is a radical transformation within which it's not clear that liberal democracy is compatible. Let me tell you the two specific threats, the two specific problems I think that this technological revolution has created that are of relevance to people in this room, especially if you care about prosperity. So I've written my concerns in a variety of articles in The Atlantic especially, but now I'm really expanding them into two books. The first is about what social media did to teen mental health, especially that of girls, and the second is about what it's doing to liberal democracy. So I'll start with this one. And it's funny, when I was preparing this talk, I sat down a few days ago, what should I say? And I said, you know what, didn't I say something about the coddling the American mind? And I went back to my first talk at this conference in 2015. Here was my title. And I was beginning to get concerned about what I was seeing on college students in 2014. It wasn't like this in 2012. In 2014, I started seeing some things that were very alarming about the future of this Gen Z. We didn't really know it at the time, but Gen Z. And so here's what I did. I started with these images that many of you know about, from the World Values Survey, about how values change as societies get prosperous. And the values move, countries move from sort of the bottom left, they move sort of up first towards secular rationalism as they industrialize, and then later they go to service industries where they worry about equality and things like that. So there's a general movement up and then to the right, and as that happens, the values change, and they change in a very consistent way around the world. So this is, I think, one of the most important findings in the social sciences right here. And so what the authors of the World Value Survey say is that fading existential pressure, you don't have to worry about war and starvation, and you can sort of like look to the future and plan for it. Fading existential pressures open people's minds, making them prioritize freedom over security, autonomy over authority, diversity over uniformity, and creativity over discipline. Now this sounds wonderful. Particularly if you're politically progressive, this is heaven. This tells you, you know what? We should just really hope for making every country prosperous because people move to the left. They'll start caring about human rights, gay rights, women's rights, animal rights, the environment. This is what happens all over the world. So this is great, right? But what I began to see in 2014, 2015 is that as you move to these new values, the way we raise children changes radically in ways that my friend Greg Lukianoff and I began thinking like, whoa, this is doing some really weird things to kids. So in general, what we know is if you get wealthier and you start investing more in your kids, strangely you have fewer and fewer kids. So you begin to have very few children. They become economically worthless but emotionally priceless, in the words I think that was from Jen Senior's book. We change our child rearing, it becomes much more humane. There's much less discipline, and now it's much more helicopter parenting. It's all about getting the kid into college, protecting them from threats. We stop letting kids out. Kids are not allowed outside unsupervised because we think they'll be kidnapped. So we literally stopped letting kids play outside in the 90s until around the age of 10 or 12. We don't let them out until 10 or 12 in America, Britain, and Canada. But there's this basic psychological principle that kids are anti-fragile. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and if we protect kids from all unpleasant circumstances, they will not grow. They do not grow. They cannot grow. And that was the theme of our article, The Coddling of the American Mind, in 2015. Now, it just so happens that so we published this article in August of 2015, and then I gave my talk here on, I think it was November 9th or 5th or something of 2015, it's 2015 we're talking about, of 2015, and it was literally a day or two after the big Halloween protests at Yale, which some of you heard about. I won't go into detail, but this was sort of like the opening national salvo of a change in college culture. This attitude spread, student protests demanding all kinds of changes and protections from word speakers, books and ideas, and speech codes, and bias response teams, and microaggression training, all this stuff. It wasn't there in 2012, it was everywhere by 2016. Greg and I connected this to some interesting sociological work on the rise of victimhood culture. And people have talked about this since the 70s. There's certain sort of psychological patterns that go along with an attitude of seeing everybody as oppressors and victims. So this is not a new thing, but it really spread once everyone was on social media. Social media was the biggest, it was like putting oxygen on a fire and boom, it just blew up. Because ideas about oppression and victimhood and vocabulary, they all spread very, very rapidly. And the point I made when I spoke here in 2015 was that victimhood culture is incompatible with individual initiative and with the dynamism agenda that many people here in this room have. It gives you a group-based view of the world. You see it's us against them, it's group versus group. When people accept the status as being a victim or being marginalized, it tends to give them an external locus of control that makes them more passive. Victims become moral dependents. There's a big decline in self-help, solving problems for yourself. At NYU, on the back of everybody's ID, of your student ID, it tells you, here's the police, the emergency, the bias response team. It's all there so that if someone says something that offends you, you call this number. Don't work it out for yourself. Call this number, we'll take care of it. We'll investigate what the professor said. So there's this big change in academic culture between 2012 and 2016 or so. You get reduced freedom of speech, people say they're walking on eggshells, and you get, because of social media, extraordinary increases in fear of saying anything that contradicts the majority view, because you will be crucified. A lot of surveys now show students are much more afraid to speak up in class because you don't know what the other students will do to you. Students are not afraid of the professors, they're afraid of each other. So Greg and I wrote all this up. We learned so much more after the article came out. We wrote this all up in a book that came out in 2018. And I've learned so much since then. These are graphs as I'm working on this new book on kids' mental health. So what we didn't fully realize when we were writing the article and even the book is that there was a gigantic generational change in mental illness that began in 2012. It wasn't there in 2010. But beginning in 2012, members of Gen Z become much more anxious. You can see that the baby boomers and Gen X don't increase at all during the 2010s in their anxiety, but the millennials go up somewhat, the red line, but it's really Gen Z that suddenly becomes very, very anxious. It's only anxiety and depression, and it's mostly hitting the girls, especially the young girls. So as you see here, depression is up for both sexes, but boys are at a much lower level, so the absolute increase is much larger for the girls. For some things like self-harm, it's only the girls that are up, and the girls are up between 100% and 200% depending on the age. Huge increase in hospitalizations for self-harm. There was no sign of this in 2011, but by 2015 you have a 100% increase in hospitalizations for self-harm for girls. Now we know, and I didn't know this when we wrote the book, we speculated maybe social media has something to do with this, we didn't know. But now 4 years later, it's really clear. Social media is a major cause of this. I laid out the argument in an Atlantic article. I don't want to go through it now. It's not just the studies that Facebook did. There's a huge amount of correlational evidence that shows small correlations if you look at screen time for all kids, but when you zoom in on social media for girls, the correlations get quite large, larger than most other public health effects. There are many true experiments as well. So my point is, social media drove, especially young women, to anxiety, depression, and a very defensive, a threat-sensitive attitude. It wasn't there in 2012, but this is the new normal in 2015. There's never been as rapid a transformation of mental health in human history as this. It shows up in the business world now, even in 2018, as soon as Gen Z began to graduate from college. Gen Z begins roughly birth year 1996. So as soon as Gen Z goes out to the work world, we start seeing added, in Society for Human Resource Management, that anxiety is a big issue companies have to deal with. We start reading about the generation of war at work, the same conflicts over speech, and I know the conflicts on campus are rarely about ideas. It's not this person made this argument, it's this word, this person used this word, and then we fight about it for weeks, and then there's another fight. And now this has come to the work world, constant conflict, often intergenerational. So the argument I made here, and again, almost all the slides I've shown you up until now, well, about half of them were from my 2015 presentation. I just updated a few. This was one from 2015. I suggested to this group that the things we're doing to children and the things we're doing in our universities may soon undermine democratic capitalism, because Gen Z is not going to have that spirit of innovation, creativity, go forth, do something, try something. Gen Z is more fragile, anxious, and risk-averse, and therefore may be less creative, dynamic, and entrepreneurial. That's what I suggested in 2015. And secondly, because Gen Z is more easily offended and morally dependent, they may be less able to manage compromise. The main way you learn the skills of democracy is on the playground. A group of kids has to work out, what are we going to do together? We don't all agree, but how are we going to figure out what to do? How are we going to enforce rules? What do we do when there are infractions? We stopped that in the 90s. We literally stopped kids from learning the skills of democracy. And Gen Z comes to college, they have a great deal of difficulty working out conflicts. We've taught them to go to administrators to solve the problems. So I am concerned about the future of democratic capitalism for that reason. So that's my first reason for being very, very alarmed. What we've done to Gen Z in ways that I think will undercut the move towards mass flourishing and prosperity. The second book, which I'm going to write as soon, which I started, but I'm going to really write as soon as I can turn the manuscript for the first, is what it's done to teen mental health. Let me just check my time. That's a counting down. Oh, good. Okay. So, life after Babel. So, I want to take you through a story. Most of you in the room remember this story. Others of you have read about it. That there was this long 20th century with all kinds of horrible things in it. I missed the worst of it, but grew up under the threat of nuclear war, the Cold War. And then all of a sudden, one day, it was the most amazing thing. That threat was just lifted. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union fell, and there was this ecstatic time, one of the best decades ever, of the 1990s, when we thought, wow, the nightmare of history is over. And of course, stuff's going to happen, but now we know its direction. It's liberal democracy. If you just let people get some property and prosperity, they want rights. And so if you just wait for China and North Korea and Iran, just wait, let's invite them and give them a little bit of a middle class, they're going to become liberal democracies too. That's what we thought. And that was the early 90s. And then the internet really comes in. And we think like, wow, now everyone's connected. Everyone has a voice. Yeah, good luck, China, keeping out the internet. Good luck, dictators, standing up to people who are connected and empowered. So we were even more confident. This was the era of techno-democratic optimism. We thought liberal democracy is the only way. Now, with social media, with technology, everyone's going to have it. Smooth sailing from here on in, we thought. And the peak year of this techno-democratic optimism was 2011, an extraordinary year that begins with the Arab Spring, and we think, wow, what happened in Eastern Europe is finally coming to the Arab world. It's going to be liberal democracy everywhere. It ends with Occupy Wall Street. Many people think, wow, this social media-enabled movement is going to finally bring down the plutocrats and push for legislation and change that's going to give us more equality. An incredible year for techno-democratic optimism. Mark Zuckerberg is Times Person of the Year in 2010, and in 2012 he takes Facebook public, and this is a very important passage from his letter to potential shareholders. He says, "Today our society has reached another tipping point." And he was right. This was the tipping point. He says everybody has access to phones. Facebook aspires to build services that give people the power to share and help them once again transform many of our core institutions and industries. Now, if you're a progressive or libertarian, this was the promise of the future. Yes, let's rebuild things. But if you're a social conservative, if you've ever read Edmund Burke, if you are conservative by disposition, then you're probably not in this world, you're not in Silicon Valley, but you're saying, wait a second, let's just let 23-year-olds rebuild institutions that we've built gradually over centuries. This is a recipe for complete disaster. It is so easy to tear things down, it's really hard to build things. So what do? Social media comes in, spreads widely, and my argument is that everything is collapsing. Our institutions are collapsing and cannot be rebuilt in the present environment. So I laid this all out in an article in The Atlantic in April. The title I gave it was Life After Babel, but they gave it, they A/B test titles. Everybody's now focused on social media, so the A/B testing found this title was superior, why the past 10 years of American life have been uniquely stupid. And I won't go into the whole argument. I just want to give you the central metaphor is the story of Babel, which is an extraordinary story, a very short story. A few generations after Noah and the flood, the human population is expanding, the people are spreading out, they come to the plain in Shinar, and they build themselves a city with a tower, and they want to make the tower reach the heavens so that God can't flood them again. Now this is hubris, this is resisting God's authority. God is not pleased. He says, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them. So he says, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. And while in the story, God doesn't literally knock over the tower, he just makes them unable to understand. Everybody speaks a different language, and so it's chaos, and they spread out. But in the common understanding, we've seen images of like God, a mighty wind comes and the tower gets knocked over and it's rubble. So what I want you to imagine what it would be like if you and all of your cousins who are descended from Noah, you built this incredible city with this gigantic tower. Imagine the pride and safety you would feel. And then imagine that one day, it all goes to hell and you can't even talk to each other. Everything is confusion. What would that be like? And my argument is we know what that would be like because that is America today. We cannot understand each other. We will never again understand each other in large quantity. We will never again have shared stories, is my argument. Widely shared stories. So how did this happen? To get a bit more specific, the internet is great. I love the internet. There are some bad things that have happened, but overall, and when I ask this of audiences, everybody loves the internet. Social media comes in, it's just one of those internet things, a new kind of thing you can do, enabled by the internet. Amazing. You can post pictures of your dog and your vacation, and people can see it. And it's easy to keep in touch with people. So early social media was not toxic at all, not harmful to democracy. Connecting people is generally a good thing, okay? So no problem, but everything changes beginning in 2009, because that's the year we get super viralized, hyper-viralized social media. First, Facebook introduces the like button, and now you have all this data on engagement, and now they've been playing with algorithms before. Now they can algorithmicize everything to maximize engagement. Even more importantly, Twitter introduces the retweet button. It used to be you'd see stuff, and you could, by effortful, you could put it in your own timeline. But now, click and you send it out to all your followers. And as we all know from tracking the coronavirus, we all understand the difference. Living in a world where something has an R0 of 1.0, an R0 of 1.0 versus 2.0. I mean, the extra virality from that increase is world-changing. So social media becomes super duper viral after 2009. It was not like this before 2009. And so the order of events goes like this. One of the engineers who created the retweet button at Twitter, and of course both platforms copied the other's innovations, and then everybody copies those two innovations. So one of the men who worked on the retweet button, he thought that this was going to give more voice to, everybody can get their word out. Yeah, everybody can get their word out, not just the people you want to get the word out. So before the retweet, he said, well, this is the author of the article. Before the retweet, Twitter was a largely convivial place after all hell broke loose. And that was my experience of it too. But as this man Chris Wetherell said, when he saw the Twitter mobs forming, we just handed a loaded weapon to a 4-year-old. It wasn't like this in 2007 or 2008, but this is the 2010s. Everyone has a gun, a dark gun, whatever you want to call it, and everybody's shooting. A lot of us just try to keep our heads down. So in 2009, we get those innovations. In 2010, Facebook fully algorithmicizes its newsfeed and really commits to the business model that is breaking the world, which is the people using it are not the customers, they're the product, and the goal is to keep them on the platform. Upworthy masters headline repackaging, and then all the other major media outlets have to adapt to the fact that now everything goes through Facebook. You don't get your own customers anymore. A big innovation was Facebook introducing threaded comments, which says to everyone, even if you only have 7 followers, you can attack someone in the comment section. Whatever someone says in the comment section, you can attack them, and then millions of people will see your attack, and it's like, let's all fight with everybody in public. So this is, again, what makes social media not a place where we can have conversations, but it puts democratic discourse into the Roman Colosseum. Everybody's fighting in front of an audience. You cannot run a democracy if that's your public square. And my argument is that this did not, Mark Zuckerberg always says, how could it be wrong to give more people more voice? But he didn't. What he did was he ended up super empowering 4 groups, the far left, the far right, trolls, and Russian agents. James Madison in Federalist 10 our founding fathers knew the problems of democracy. They knew about our tendency towards faction, that we're much more likely to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good, and they designed systems that would dampen that down, that would force the necessity of compromise in Congress and elsewhere. That's what it used to be like. And Madison knew that we're prone to triviality. This is the next sentence after in Federalist 10 is this: so strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions. This is a description of Twitter. This is what Twitter's done to political discourse. It's all about some stupid little thing that we wouldn't waste time on beforehand, but now life is a succession of stupid little things. Martin Gurry pointed out that social media is great at tearing things down. It fragments us. The public isn't one thing. It's highly fragmented and basically mutually hostile. Because of the digital revolution, it's now people mostly yelling at each other and living in bubbles of one sort or another. So we are now living in James Madison's nightmare. This is not a world in which you can have a liberal democracy, I believe. We're going to have to make major changes if liberal democracy in the United States is to survive. Our politics becomes very, very different in the late 2010s. This is not just a few anecdotes. By all the measures I've seen of the number of democracies and their quality, it's going down in the late 2010s. I'll skip this article except to say that countries that have really dropped in their democratic quality are precisely those countries that have most increased in political polarization, that is, hatred of the other side. Because when you hate the other side, your activism, your violence even, is necessary. People begin to justify violence because it's necessary given how terrible the other side is. So to conclude, I believe we are now in the post-Babel era. I think this has enormous implications for the private sector and the public sector. This incredibly rapid change that transformed our social lives and our consciousness, which I'm writing about in these two books, has radically changed the business world. So we first saw it after Donald Trump was elected. We saw CEOs getting much more political, responding in part to pressures on social media. We've seen generational conflicts caused in part by changes in social media. And we're just seeing a lot more conflict in companies. I mean, talk to people, not in all sectors, but certainly in journalism, media, the arts, tech, the more progressive sectors of the economy. Talk to them about what corporate life is like now. And it's just like academic life, walking on eggshells, fear of being publicly shamed. It makes it hard to cooperate, makes it hard to trust, makes it hard to enjoy work anymore. And so that's what I began to suggest in 2015. I think things have gotten a lot worse since then. And that's why I think that social media has fragmented everything and made it harder to run and staff organizations. Thank you. So we have some time for questions?
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yes, you choose to go ahead.
Sorry, James McIntosh, Wall Street Journal. It's very interesting. I just wondered if you can talk a bit about how the tribalism that we see in the television media has fed it, because that seems to have risen perhaps slightly earlier, but to a just as great an extent.
Yes.
You didn't mention it, but
no, you're right.
It's discussed as a major impact on politics.
It is. Yes, so I didn't say it now, but I did say it in the Atlantic article, that if you look at the graphs of polarization, and I only focus on affective polarization, that is the degree in which you hate the other side. Political polarization is fine. Having people with different policy views is no problem. It's when you hate the other side. And if you look at the graphs, it was actually very low in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It begins rising in the 80s, 90s, in part because of cable TV, microcasting. The end of mass media, we move to narrowcasting. So you're right, that's a big part, and that really contributes, especially radicalizes the Republican, the right in particular. And the lines just keep going up through the era of social media. And this is one of Facebook's rebuttals to me is, hey, it started before Facebook, so we can't be responsible. And there's some truth to that if you just look at cross-partisan hostility. But my argument here is twofold. First, this isn't just about cross-partisan. This is about the fragmentation of everything. Look within left-wing movements. They're all at each other's throats now. Now, of course, Monty Python argued that it was always that way, but it's much more so now because of social media. The other piece of it is, look what's happened to cable TV. Cable TV, like let's take Fox News, they used to be very good at finding stories that would outrage people, but like they had to have a producer, they had someone that look into it, and it took a while to find a good story. Now all you do, just open in the morning, open up Twitter, trending topics, you have this incredible market research firm telling you what is the most outrageous thing that I can take out of context today and put on in 5 minutes all day long. So cable TV is much nastier because of Twitter. Everything is much nastier because of Twitter. Microphones, this guy here, and then, okay, and then I'll go over there. Okay, yes, you go ahead.
Sorry to repeat a second. So, the expression that the Twitterverse is not the whole world. The focus on social media as driving everything, is there a risk of it being too limited a sample, like the restaurant downtown? 2009, you had the retweet and the like button. There's also the financial crisis in place, wiping out huge savings of people around the world. people losing their homes, a global phenomenon. We have from Chile to Sweden, populist movements coming in. I mean, the yellow vest in France, can that be explained by people on social media shouting at one another? No doubt that's an exacerbating factor, but how about
Yes,
for
no, thank
broader
you. Yes,
socioeconomic-
no, for right-wing populist, well, actually for populist movements that are against the elites, yes. There you do find clear influence of economic factors and the global financial crisis. There I would agree with you. For teen mental health, there's no chance because it's the opposite. Teen mental health craters, so the economy craters in 2009, but there's no sign of a problem for teen mental health until 2013. And then as the economy is getting better and better and unemployment's going down and down, teen mental health is getting worse and worse. Also, the decline of democracies doesn't start right after the global financial crisis. It's only after 2016. It's only after, I think it has more to do with social media. If you go to jonathanhaidt.com/social media, I have several collaborative review docs where I've collected hundreds of studies on all sides about what is the culpability of social media here. So I'm debating with other scholars. Economic factors surely play a role. But I think that social media, with each decade through the 2010s, social media plays a bigger and bigger role, and economic factors play less of a role. Also, because everything is now filtered through social media, so even we don't know what economic reality is hard to find, but stories about it are now stuffed down your throat all the time. So let's go. I guess we'll. Okay. Let's see this woman here in the front row.
Thank you. A lot of food for thought there. My name's Diane Coyle, University of Cambridge. I've got a question about the kids part, and it's whether the problem is the parenting more than the social media. If you look at a country like the Netherlands, where there's a very different style of parenting, are the outcomes different? And secondly, isn't it a dynamic process, and won't whatever the generation that's post-Z, whatever we call it, A or AA, be itself different and much more sophisticated?
So parenting matters a lot. It's not so much individual parenting. I believe it is the culture of parenthood such that kids, so in the Germanic countries, kids still are allowed out, kids are taught how to make fire when they're 6 years old, I'm told. There are forest schools. So the Germanic countries have done a good job of not overprotecting their kids. All the Anglo countries did the exact same thing at the same time, except for Australia and New Zealand, they were a few years delayed. But US, Canada, Britain, doing exactly the same thing, overprotecting the kids. So culture matters for whether it gives childhood or not. The second point was about future generations. Some things in life are negative feedback systems, like a pendulum, where the further out it goes, the more the pressure is to come back. Others are positive feedback systems, like a tower, where the further it goes, the faster it's going to fall. Gen X and the older millennials are the last Americans who played outside without guards, and they're raising their children overprotected. In about 10, 20 years, there'll be nobody left who remembers what it was like to let kids go outside and not think that they were going to get kidnapped. So I don't see, and plus, since Gen Z is so anxious, I don't see how they're ever going to let their kids out of their sight. So this is one of the reasons that I think we're in a positive feedback loop where rates of mental illness are going to just keep climbing until 120% of our kids are mentally ill. Okay, let's end on that note. I guess we're out of time. Thank you very much.